Hi, I'm Mike Chen. I write Star Wars, Star Trek, Marvel, and other science fiction stuff, and you're listening to Genuine Chit-Chat.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Genuine Chit-Chat. This week I am chatting with Leyna of the Doug Vincent System. So apologies, this was released one day later than usual. Life has just been very busy planning for weddings and all that kind of jazz, but this is such an incredible conversation. I'm sure you all agree it was worth the wait. So I'm speaking with Leyna. Now, Leyna is a part of the Doug Vincent System. Now, the Doug Vincent System is essentially an individual with Dissociative Identity Disorder. I do say that wrong at the start of this conversation, and Leyna does correct me, so keep an ear out for that. But essentially, it's a condition that's brought on by severe repetitive trauma at a very young age. Now, you may know these things likely from problematic portrayals of it in the media. Split with James McAvoy is probably the most famous one I think people will know, but also more recently the Marvel Plus series Moon Knight, which I really enjoy, and Leyna does actually have some very positive things to say about that. So I'm not going to delve any deeper into defining DID because that is what this entire conversation is really about. It's about debunking misconceptions, speaking about the true people who actually experience DID and where all these misconceptions came from, but getting to know the people affected by this disorder. It's something that people barely really talk about, and even myself in this conversation get a few things wrong, but Leyna does correct me in those, and I've kept them all in just to show that I am also not perfect. I make mistakes even when doing hours of my own research, but Leyna was incredibly kind, was really honest and very open about a lot of things, and I will mention that there is a small trigger warning here because suicidal thoughts and self-harm are briefly discussed at some point in this conversation, but we don't talk about it too much. So we do talk about quite a few other bits and pieces, but it was really great speaking with Leyna, and we've been emailing and we've got ideas for more conversation we're going to have both with herself and also some of her alters and things. It's going to be a great time this year with many of the conversations that I have with the Doug Vincent System. But links are in the description to other appearances on podcasts that Leyna has made, including some resources as well that you want to check out after listening to this conversation, and a few other bits and pieces. But I'll be back at the end to give you more information on what's to come and that sort of thing. Please make sure you like, subscribe, share with your friends, all that amazing stuff. But friends, without further ado, here is Leyna of the Doug Vincent System. Welcome to Genuine Chit-Chat, where we have honest conversations with interesting people. And I'm your host, Mike Burton. I am here today with a very special individual who a lot of people who are fans of Moon Knight may actually already be familiar with. Now, I'm speaking with Leyna of the Douglas Vincent System, and Leyna has appeared on the Into the Night podcast, the Moon Knight podcast, and several episodes actually. She's also been a consultant for Jed MacKay on his Moon Knight run, I believe issues 14 and 15. And if anyone has picked up Scott Weatherly's Waxing and Waning essay collection for Moon Knight, then you can also check out We Are Moon Knight, which is also by Leyna. So a big Moon Knight fan for a variety of reasons, but I think there's one quite major reason why. So Leyna, hello there. Thank you so much for making time to come on the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your connection with Moon Knight, and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. And well, my connection with Moon Knight is that I have something in common with him, and which is that I'm an alter in a DID system, Dissociative Identity Disorder. And I've been starting in 2016 when the movie Split came out, that sort of galvanized me to want to on the internet and start telling my story about DID and educating people about it, because there's far too much misinformation and stigma out there about DID, and that I feel like a lot of people, the only thing they know about DID is what they've seen in movies and TV shows and things like that, which most of them are wildly inaccurate. So I decided to be proactive and start trying to educate people about it. And after a couple of years of doing this, I was starting to get frustrated because I was just trying to find conversations on the internet about DID and engage in as many random conversations as I could. And I was kind of getting stretched thin and kind of feeling like I was now a focus, and I felt like I needed more of a focus on my efforts for ID education. And so decided, since we're big comic book fans in our system, I decided to maybe focus on that and trying to educate comic book fans about DID. And then I latched on to Moon Knight because that's one of the biggest characters out there with DID. And at the time, I didn't even know very much about Moon Knight myself. And so I started listening to the Into the Night podcast to educate myself about Moon Knight, and started reading all the issues along with the podcast. as I went through all the episodes of the podcast, and then I eventually got the courage to approach Ray, of the host of the podcast, and ask if it would be all right if I could write articles about DID, about how it's represented in Moon Knight, and he could read those in the podcast, because I wasn't yet comfortable with actually having my voice on the podcast. So he said, yeah, that'd be great. And so I did that there was 3 of those, and then I started actually being on episodes, and that led to other opportunities, like being a consultant for Jed McKay and some other podcast episodes. And
it's amazing. Yeah, it's one of those where, so it's an interesting sort of connection with Moon Knight, because, you know, with Moon Knight, I think because they're such an obscure character, so many different people connect with Moon Knight in different ways. And I think a lot of Moon Knight's mental health struggles, which have varied depending on who's writing Moon Knight, quite wildly, and how accurate they are to real life in a lot of respects. But I find that he, as a character, just connects with people in a very different way to most other superheroes. I mean, even myself, like, I didn't come through Moon Knight in a standard way of picking up a comic and seeing him. It was Scott Weatherly. He mentioned Moon Knight a couple of times, and I was like, they sound cool. So I was like, Scott, I can't be bothered to do my research, so you just come on my show and just tell me about Moon Knight for 2 hours. And then from there, I did a bit of my own reading and stuff. And then the Disney Plus series came out, and then I was like, okay, I need to read a lot more. I want to delve more into this, because I absolutely adore the series. Partly for my love of Oscar Isaac, I will say, because I love him so much. But with that, I connected with Scott, and then when he was releasing the Waxing and Waning essay collection, which obviously you contributed to, when that happened, then I was like, cool, delving straight back in. And from there, you know, I haven't listened to the Into the Night podcast that much. I listened to some of your appearances, but it does seem like, from what Scott tells me as well, it has such an incredible community. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Into the Night Facebook page, you've been quite active as well, speaking with people about DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder, which is something that's very hard to say over and over again 3 times. But I've heard that, am I right in thinking that in that kind of Facebook group, that's kind of almost before you even reached out to Ray?
Yeah, I've been active in the Facebook group and also in the Discord that they have for Into the Night. Yeah, I haven't been as active recently as I have been in the past, but yeah, I'm definitely there and willing to talk to anybody that wants to ask me questions. And
what exactly sparked off? Like, we'll delve into the DID in a moment, but what did anything in particular really spark? I know you said sort of 2016 was around that kind of time, but was there anything? It was Split that you mentioned, which was the thing that kind of the catalyst for you to want to go out into the world and speak to people about DID a bit more. So with Split in itself, so that's the first way I ever heard of DID. As I mentioned to you off air, I never really heard of DID. I saw Split and I was like, seemingly it's a thing in a film, and I imagine because M. Night Shyamalan and the genre of the film, I imagine that it's not that accurate, and then I just kind of not quite forgot about it, but I didn't really think about DID, you know. And then from there, I didn't really think about it again until Moon Knight, and then it connected with Moon Knight, and Scott mentioned it as well, and then I read your essay, which is really interesting, and I would say anyone who's a fan of Moon Knight should pick up the essay collection, but especially with Leyna's essay as well. But with Split, so the portrayal of DID has varied over the years in quite a few different pieces of media. Could you tell us what about Split specifically bothered you, and what was the thing that made you want to kind of reach out into the world and discuss it with people?
Well, I will admit, first of all, that I haven't actually seen the movie Split. Just the trailer alone was enough to make me want to not ever see the movie, because it was yet another in a long line of horror movies about DID that portray us as snappers and serial killers. And in reality, I mean, there have been studies that have shown that DID and other serious mental disorders like schizophrenia and other things are not actually significantly higher percentage of rate of committing violent crimes than anybody else in the general population. But yet we have this stigma that people think that we're extremely violent and extremely murderous and all this stuff because of movies like Split and others, you know, like going all the way back to the movie Psycho, which was supposedly about schizophrenia. I mean, that's what they said in the in the movie, but it was basically more like DID than it was schizophrenia, which is another problem that a lot of times get those two confused. They're definitely not the same.
Yeah, it's one of those where, because the more that I've researched DID and things, it's, a dissociative disorder in itself has a lot of facets to it. And then because of that, there's a lot of misdiagnoses, and then there's a lot of symptoms of other mental illness, such as schizophrenia. There are certain elements of that which cross over to things like DID, but there is just such a widespread amount of, misinformation and more specifically misdiagnoses as well, which doesn't help with the misinformation then with what movies and stuff do from there. So when we delve into dissociative identity disorder in itself, so from what I understand is approximately on average about 1.5% of people in the USA have it, but the vast majority of them are undiagnosed. And that the general idea, as far as I understand, is that it is caused by childhood trauma that is repeated, very severe repeated childhood trauma. It says the majority of the time it is abuse, but it can also be triggered by frequent visits to like a hospital and having lots of surgeries and things like that. It could also trigger something like that at a very young age. So I wondered if you could speak. You do not have to speak about your specific trauma, because I can imagine that's an incredibly difficult and very personal part to you. But from what you understand about your own DID, do you think that, yes, it was a symptom of trauma? How would you define DID to someone who's never heard of it before?
Well, first of all, I think in order to define DID, you first have to define the word dissociation, which one thing that I've noticed is that almost everybody, when they first start learning about DID, they mispronounce dissociation as disassociation, which I've noticed you've done, which I'm not trying to call you out.
Do it. I need to be called out. I need to learn. So please, again, sorry. Say it one more time.
It's dissociation, not disassociation.
I'll make sure in the intro I say it correctly. So
one good way to remember that is there's no ass in dissociation.
Very nice. Very nice.
But, yeah, it's confusing because disassociation is actually a real word, but it's a word that has a much more general meaning. It means to undo an association between any two things, but dissociation has a very specific meaning, and that is it's when the human brain kind of distracts itself from what's going on around you, what's going on in the external world, as a result of something unpleasant in the external world that you want to avoid. And so your brain kind of distracts itself, which is something that everybody does to a certain extent. Like the mildest form of dissociation would be daydreaming. Like everybody daydreams at some point. And usually when you're daydreaming, it's because of the fact that you're bored or because somebody's yelling at you and you don't want to listen to what they're saying, something like that, something unpleasant in your environment that you want to escape from. And that's why you're daydreaming. Well, DID is the most extreme, on the opposite end of the spectrum, the most extreme form of dissociation, where something is so traumatic that you want to escape it so much that you create a separate identity so that one identity can escape inside your mind while the other identity comes out and is present for whatever is going on in the external world. So that's how it starts. And the reason why it always starts in childhood is because it has to start forming before the age that a person's personality is fully formed. So in the early years of childhood, the personality is more malleable and more permanent and less fully formed. And so that's when the personality can sort of diverge and form separate identities. And once the personality is fully formed at a certain age, which is usually most experts agree is somewhere around 6 to 9 years of age. Once that happens, then from that point on, if a person hasn't formed DID by then, you're not going to it for the rest of your life. You can form PTSD at any age and other disorders like that. But for DID specifically, it always starts in early childhood. And one thing that people misunderstand about DID is that because of movies and TV shows, that it's very easy to spot, and that when different alters come out, they're always speaking in different accents and different tones of voice and wearing different clothes, and it's extremely obvious for people to spot, which is usually not the case. The research has shown that only about 5 to 6% of people with DID have what's known as a more overt presentation, where it's easy to spot different alters, and the other 94 to 95% have what's more called covert, which means it's much more hidden and harder to spot. And that's part of the reason why it's so often misdiagnosed, is because it's actually very difficult to spot, and that's because the whole reason for creating DID is for hiding. It's so that we can hide our reactions to trauma and still go on with our daily life and be a functioning person. And it's basically a coping mechanism that helps us to be able to cope with the trauma and not be overwhelmed by it, by dividing the trauma between different identities.
Yeah, there's one thing that one of your alters posted on X, formerly Twitter, which was on DID Awareness Day, which I think is March 5th, which was, I believe Denise D said that a lot of people don't seem to understand that they think that the multiple identities is sort of the worst part about DID, when actually it's the dealing with the trauma, dealing with the thing that caused the DID is far worse than dealing with the alters, the multiple identity elements of it. And I found that very interesting and very hard hitting, because it's not something that I'd ever really considered before about, a mental illness of that caliber.
Yeah, definitely the trauma is the worst thing about it. Yeah. The multiple identities is something that you can learn to live with, and you can learn to, basically you need to learn to cooperate with each other and communicate with each other. And it's basically like, once you start working with each other, it's basically like working with family or a group of friends, or, it's any interpersonal group dynamics. It's basically the same as that. But instead of in the external world, it's in the internal world within yourself and within your own mind. And so that in itself makes it a little bit more difficult, because of the fact that you can't get away from the other people. If you have disagreements or whatever, you have to work harder to find compromises and find a way to get along, because there's no getting away from anybody else in the system.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's so speaking of that, like the experience that you have. So every member of the Douglas Vincent system is an alter. And so with that, how do you, like, to explain to individuals like myself who obviously don't have DID, how, I know it's hard because obviously you probably don't have a memory of not having DID. So it's quite an interesting thing of the way you've perceived the world is going to be different to the way, say, I have perceived the world for the entirety of their lives. But in a maybe a visual sense or something, how would you describe the experience of being an alter in the Douglas Vincent system, when it comes to communicating with the other alters and things? I've read quite a little bit online, but I think different individuals have different experiences. So I wondered, in your own words, how you would describe communication between the alters, sort of inside your mind, as well as, do you need to ever write anything down to remind anyone else? Like, how do the communications go all together between the alters?
Well, something that very much varies a lot between systems. There's some systems have a lot of difficulty communicating between alters inside their mind, and so some systems they literally have to write everything down to be able to communicate, because they're not able to communicate within their mind, so they have to communicate externally, thereby leaving notes or filming videos of themselves, giving messages to other alters, that kind of thing. But with our system, it's been we do have the ability to talk to each other internally, and we have the ability to look inside and see our internal world. But one thing about our system that's a lot different than a lot of other systems, although I have met other systems online that have had similar experience, but one thing that's different about us is that we have a lot less external world amnesia between alters, but we have a lot a lot of internal world amnesia instead of that. And so before we were consciously aware of the fact that we have DID, that's the way we kept our secret from ourselves, basically, is by forgetting the internal world memories so that whenever different alters would come out, they would still think of themselves as Doug because they didn't remember who they were in the internal world. Basically, whether it's internal world amnesia or external world amnesia, basically the mind usually tries to keep DID a secret even from ourselves for as long as it possibly can until something happens that we become aware of each other, and then we start to become aware of the fact that we have DID, and then we have to start dealing with that and learning how to live with it.
Because the first thing I think of is in the Moon Knight Disney Plus series is when Stephen and Marc delve deep into sort of Marc and Stephen's memories, into the consciousness, and you see where Stephen Grant kind of came from, and Stephen Grant has that realization. And in the portrayal that we see there, like the interactions between Stephen Grant and Marc Spector, would you say of on-screen media that's the closest to at least how you experience that, or do you have any comments on that regard?
I do think that the Moon Knight TV series in general was a lot more accurate than a lot of other depictions of DID. But then again, that's not saying much because most other depictions of DID are very, very, very inaccurate. Mm-hmm. But there were certain things that I really, really loved about that show that were unlike any other show that I've seen as far as portrayal of DID. One of the things that I really liked a lot was the fact that Stephen was the one you got to know first, and the audience got to know first and to fall in love with first. And because of that, you got a real sense of the reality of Stephen before you got to know that he was a separate alter that was not the one that had the birth name of the system, and that was very powerful because it helped to solidify that alters are not like fake people or like made up identities or like imaginary friends, or we're just as human as anybody else. That's something that a lot of times portrayals of DID kind of wrong, is that they kind of portray alters as fake people or made up people, or not as real as the one that has the name of the system, the birth name. Seeing
it as like a main character almost, which is not the way it should be. It's not a main and then co-stars. It's all even. And I think Doug posted on X as well on DID Day again. He said it was humbling to really have that realization that just because he shared the name of the system didn't mean that he was the air quotes main character. I am paraphrasing that element.
Yeah, and another thing I really liked about that show was the fact that when they were switching between Stephen and Marc, they were not able to switch until they gave each other permission, or they allowed that to happen. Like Marc was like begging Stephen to let him out, and then later it was the opposite, that Stephen was out and Marc was out and Stephen was asking him to let him be out, and that's something that's actually a lot more accurate than a lot of portrayals, because a lot of portrayals will make it seem like it's easy for the part that's in charge the parts that's out in the system to get a different alter and choose to switch to that alter, whether or not that alter wants to or not, which in reality, you can only make switches happen easily if both of the parts involved in the switch are willing to make that happen. Otherwise, if you try to do it against the other's will, it's very, very difficult, and it actually can cause headaches, both literally and physically and metaphorically.
No, I can imagine. How do yourselves balance this element? I suspect that it's much better now than it sort of was years ago. Like, how has the journey been? I know part of it was going to therapy and having people be, or just kind of completely horrible therapists and horrible people to you and disregard, the true struggles that you were having. And then from what I understand is that it's gotten better and you did get, better guidance that you needed. I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit about that kind of journey and how it's married up with yourself and the alters kind of being able to be at peace with each other a bit more.
Yeah, basically, we were misdiagnosed for about 10 years in therapy before we finally got a proper diagnosis of DID. And that was actually the first alter that Doug became aware of back when we were about 17 years old. And at that point, we didn't know what was going on, and we were very confused. And Doug approached his mom and asked if she could allow us to have therapy. And our mom kind of talked with Doug a little bit to make sure that he was genuinely needing therapy and not just standard teenager blowing things out of proportion or whatever. And after Doug talked with our mom for a little bit, she realized that yes, he does actually need some therapy, and so he took us to a Christian counselor, and he was a very nice guy, and he wanted to help us, but I think he quickly realized that he was out of his depth, and so he referred us to a psychologist, and we were with him for a few years, and then we needed medication, so he referred us to a psychiatrist, and then we got on some medications, some antidepressants, and antipsychotic medication, which they explained to us at the time that they didn't necessarily think we were psychotic, but antipsychotic meds can help with like confusion and that sort of thing. And basically, all of these therapists that were telling us that I was delusion and that I needed to be gotten rid of or merged with Doug in order so that Doug could live a normal life because he was the real one. And basically, they weren't understanding how DID actually works. They were just trying to force me to be merged with Doug or be gotten rid of or whatever. And we didn't know any better because we didn't know anything about DID at the time. And so we were just going along with what they said, and we were trying to merge myself and Doug. And then also there were a couple of other alters we became aware of in this time period, Lilith and Heidi. We were trying to merge all four of us. And for times that we thought it worked, but then eventually we would realize that we had been fooling ourselves and we weren't actually merged, and then we'd have to start all over again. And then after about 10 years of this, we actually, the therapist that we were seeing, we saw the psychiatrist, because the psychiatrist couldn't see us very, very often. He would only see us for like 15 minutes every 3 or 4 months just for a med checkup, basically. But another one of the nurse practitioners in his office was actually doing our regular therapy. And she actually had to leave that practice. She was going into a teaching position, I think, or something like that. And so we got a different therapist within that practice. And we only saw him a few times before he started to realize that he was out of his depth and that he wasn't going to be able to help us because we were too complicated for what he was prepared to deal with. And so at that point, we were without a therapist, and we were kind of panicking a little bit because we needed a therapist, but we didn't have one, and we didn't know where to turn. And so we were talking about this with a Bible study group that we were in at the time, our church. And one of the ladies in this Bible study group said, actually, what you describing sounds like DID. And I actually know a therapist who specializes in DID. And so he actually introduced us to him. And he was actually a Christian also. And he actually told us about DID. And he gave us some tests to make sure that that's what we actually had. And we tested positive. So he started teaching us about it. And he started telling us that we don't necessarily have to merge. We can learn to cooperate and communicate with each other and learn to live as a functional system together without merging. That actually sounded really good to us because at that point we'd been trying and failing for about 10 years to merge. And so learning that we don't have to try that anymore, that was relief, actually. And also finding out that there was somebody that actually knew what was going on with us and knew how to treat it, that was a huge relief. And so we went through therapy with him for quite a few years after that, about 16 years. And he taught us a lot and taught us how to communicate with each other and operate. But then he was ready to retire. And so we had to find a new therapist, and fortunately, we were able to find another one in our area that was not as experienced as he was in DID, but had learned a lot about it and had joined the ISSTD, which is an organization that does a lot of research on DID, and she had joined that to learn more about DID, and we've been with her for about really close to a year now, and been going pretty well.
Amazing. And so how would you say that in the earlier days, when you, Leyna, when you and Doug first recognized each other, obviously for years you didn't know what DID was. How was your experience with Doug in a sense of the way it is now, where you can communicate with the other alters and you're both willing to take the body, the vessel? When it was just yourself and Doug in the early days and you weren't aware of what the condition actually was, how was it then when it came to controlling the body, in essence? Was it a random thing? Were you be able to communicate and you could hear each other's voices in your head when the other was in control? Like, how was that in the early days compared to now?
Well, it started with just Doug being able to hear my voice in his head, and actually took us a little while to realize that I was actually able to come out and take control of the body. And the first few times that happened, it really freaked me out and freaked Doug out, and we were both really very confused and very weirded out by this whole experience. And it was very difficult because we had no clue what was going on. And but a lot of times back in those days, the switches would be a lot more random and it would happen at random times. And we would just have to, like, if I would come out at very inopportune times, like when we were at school or whatever, I would just have to learn to mask myself and make myself act more like Doug would act, and which was difficult, but I learned to adapt pretty quickly. But there were a few friends that we knew at the time in high school that we told what was going on, and we kind of let them in. We definitely were not open with it with everybody because we were afraid of how people would react.
Understandably so. And with the other alters, such as Heidi and Lilith, how was it that they were discovered in a sense? Like, did you and Doug start hearing a new voice? Did you hear the voice and then you could see them inside the sort of the internal elements? How did that sort of come about?
Well, I know with Lilith, it happened through a dream, actually, when we were asleep. We had a dream about Doug and myself and this other person. And when we woke up, we had this strong feeling that other person was actually another, person inside of our head, for lack of a better term, because we didn't know, back then we didn't know to call it an alter or a part or whatever. We just knew that they were like voices in our head and like people in our head that we could, switch out. And so, and I think it was the same way with Heidi also, that we covered her through a dream also. And that's actually happened several times to us throughout our, not always, that's not always how we find out about parts that we didn't know about, but it happened several times that now we've learned to recognize it. And so now when it happens, something like that, we know immediately when we have that feeling, when we wake up from a dream, that this person that in the dream that we didn't know before, we have a strong feeling that they're actually real. This is a clue that they're an alter that we just haven't found yet. And then we go actually searching for them, and we usually find them pretty quickly.
Have you found that over the years you have discovered alters? Is it like random, like two could happen in a week and then none for years? Has it started slowing down when you had more appropriate sort of therapy and things, or is it random? Like, is there any sort of pattern to the frequency of meeting new alters?
Well, after we first started seeing the therapist that diagnosed us with DID and started learning more about DID, it started happening really rapidly, actually, because we started finding out that there were a lot more alters than we thought we had, and we just didn't know about them yet. But, it was very frightening to us at first to realize that there were a lot more of us than we thought there were. And we were meeting at that time we were meeting several more alters every week. And wow. It was quickly growing from the 4 that we knew about to 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. It was growing and growing and growing. And we were starting to get afraid, is there going to be any end to this? Because the other thing is, we had met some other systems that have had, because we were in a DID therapy group for our therapist, one that diagnosed us with DID, and we met other systems in that group that had several hundred, or even one that had over 2,000 alters.
Wow.
And so we were starting to get afraid that we might have hundreds or thousands of alters. And it turned out that by the time it started slowing down, we had about 60 or so. And now we've met a few others since then, and now we're up to about 74. That's how many we know about now.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize it was that many.
Yeah. Usually when I tell people, when people ask how many alters we have, I usually give them context. Before I tell our number, I like to give context first of we met other systems with hundreds or thousands of alters. Yeah. Because a lot of people have the misconception, again due to media, that it's usually like 10, 15, maybe 20 at the most.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
And and a lot of times can be, around that size, but it can also be a lot larger.
And are some of the alters sort of louder and more noticeable than others, or is it because with that kind of that number? If I know it's not quite this simple, so this is what I'm trying to understand slightly more, which is if you had 100 alters, then that would be, or let's say 90 alters, then it would almost be, one. If one had the vessel every day, each day, then that would be a cycle of 3 months, which obviously I know that isn't how it works, but in my mind of conceptualizing that, so thinking of having even more, I would like, how do these systems function with the alters being kept happy? I would presume that with that volume of alters, it's very difficult are some alters just not wanting to control the body at all? They're fine to be on the back seat, or do some alters, like, how does the time get divvied up? That's I suppose part of what I'm kind of thinking of that volume of individuals.
Well, there does have to be a certain organization about it. And with our system, there are quite a few that are content to stay in the internal world most of the time. And there are some that have very specific functions that are internal world functions that require them to be in the internal world most of the time. And there are really only about maybe 15 to 20 of us or so that take part in our external world daily life on a regular basis. But I heard that from talking to people that have a lot larger systems, that a lot of times what they need to do is they have like teams of alters that, like this team of alters will be the work team, and this team of alters will be the parenting team, and that kind of thing. And so a lot of times they do a lot more of what's called being co-present, which is more than one alter being put in the body at the same time. And also co-consciousness, which is when one alter is out and other alters are observing from the internal world very closely. A thing called co-consciousness.
Is that very common for your system?
I think it's very common for especially co-consciousness. Co-presence is not as common with us, but it's something that we can. Well, it's something that does happen randomly sometimes, because switching isn't always as black and white, as cut and dried as the media makes it out to be. A lot of times it can become somewhat blurry, and like sometimes we don't even know ourselves without it. Sometimes, especially if we're in a triggered state or an activated state, like our trauma responses have been activated, a lot of times it makes it more difficult to know who's out, because just kind of we have sometimes very rapid switching or very blurry switching those times. I'm trying to remember what your question was.
No, I mean, it's more, they're not specific. The question, so I think, was more about sort of allocation of time, but you did sort of answer that, because, with around 70 alters, but only 15 or 20 sort of, for the most part, are in the outward facing world. So that does make a bit more sense to me in sort of those time allocations. And I suppose that, as you say, with the comparison with some of the systems that have more alters, it is kind of like, oh, this alter prefers work. This alter, the only thing they really want to do is play video games or those kinds of things. I assume that's it's a very overly simplistic way of looking at it. But in those scenarios, is that how your system has kind of worked together? Is you've all kind of got general things that yourselves like to do? Like obviously yourself, Leyna, you like Moon Knight a lot. Whereas I know that I recall you saying that Doug really likes Star Wars, for example. And I know that there can be, crossover, as there are with all people. But is that kind of how your system works out, of just generally, I like to do these kind of things, Doug likes to do these kinds of things? Is that generally how I'm understanding it?
Well, basically what we've been trying to do is figure out where we fit in the system as far as our roles and like as far as where we can be useful and productive members of the system and work together to help each other. And that's more how we define ourselves and our likes and dislikes, basically. But like for myself, for a long time, some of the others in the system used to joke that I was the therapist of the system because of the fact that I am very fascinated with psychology and how the brain works and like to figure out how people tick and that kind of thing. But recently I've been realizing that, with my role as far as trying to advocate DID online and that kind of thing, and also usually when we first tell one of our personal friends about our DID, I'm usually the one that helps explain it to them, because we found out that I do a better job generally of explaining DID and in a way that people understand more so than the other alters. And I'm starting to realize that I am more of the PR person of our system. That's what my role is, basically. And then we have other alters that have different roles, like there's one that's our spiritual protector and one that's our emotional protector, and another alter that is what's called a gatekeeper alter, which she helps with switching, like especially when there's conflicts on who wants to be out and who doesn't want to be out. She can help smooth that over and help us to have more smooth transitions. And so there's different roles in the system that, and we're basically, that's part of what we've been trying to figure out in therapy, is where we all fit in and where we can all use our individual talents to help each other out and help the system as a whole to run more smoothly.
I see. Are there any, the gatekeeper alter, for example, are they someone I would presume who, because they assist with the switching, they're someone who stays in the internal world? Have there been any alters who their role is in the internal world, but they've just dabbled, trying out being in the external world, and then decided that they want to come in? You don't have to name names. I don't want you getting in trouble. But like, you know what I mean? Like, is there any, because I for one, I'm very much an extrovert. So I would want to be front and center all the time. Whereas I've got friends of mine who would be like, if I was part of a system with certain friends of mine, they would be like, Mike can do all the talking all the time. He can be at the front. He can be the one at the front that when we go to parties and don't know anyone, he can be the one dealing with that. Whereas I want to be safe at home, and then maybe when there's like when it's getting late at night and I can read a book, that'll be the other one. So I wondered if that kind of idea, because I'm basically projecting of being like, I wouldn't want to be in the internal world because I'm such an extrovert, and I didn't know if there'd been any alters that were like, I'm in the internal world, but I just want to try dabbling. Or because with the co-consciousness, I can understand how you could almost trial it. And obviously the step sort of before that is almost, I can't remember the term you used, but being able to watch at the same time. So I wondered if there's alters that have started to watch and go, oh, that's interesting, let me try co-consciousness, and then be like, actually, I'm done with that. You don't have to name anyone, but has that kind of discussion, is that kind of the way your system is trying to organize itself, as well as obviously the utilizing their own skills as much?
Yeah, we definitely have some in our system that are mostly internal most of the time, but move out once in a while. And we definitely do have certain alters that are more extroverted and others that are more introverted, which actually we've become quite fascinated with. I don't know if you ever heard of something called the Myers-Briggs type indicator.
No, I'm afraid I haven't.
It's a personality test that basically puts people into different personality types, basically based on...
is that like the letter thing?
Yeah, yeah.
Wait, I've done that. I'm protagonist. So I've got, I remember doing that. Sorry, I have done that. It's quite a lengthy-ish test. But yeah, I came out as like ridiculously extroverted, what is basically the main protagonist of their own story and that kind of thing. So yeah, sorry to cut in there, but yes, I am aware of it. Thank you for elaborating.
Yeah. And we learned about that from a friend of ours, and then we instantly became fascinated with taking that test as different alters, to see if we had different personality types, and we thought we do. And but of course, with 74 alters in our system and only 16 different personality types, there are definitely more than one of us with different the same personality type. But since the test also gives you percentages of how extroverted or introverted you are, you definitely see that even the ones that have the same personality type have different percentages. And so we found that fascinating to as a tool to be able to help us to figure out which of us would be good at which roles, and which of us would be more suited to public speaking, or which of us would be more suited to working at a desk job, that kind of thing. So yeah, we actually we found out that I'm introverted, but just barely. I'm like very close to the center between introverted and extroverted.
What I was going to say with, that's very interesting. I mean, that you're actually more in the introverted part, even though you're kind of the Douglas Vincent sort of system spokesperson in a sense, is with that is quite interesting. I mean, I unfortunately I can't hide my extroversion. And when I did the test, I think I was like 90-something% or something insane. And I was like, I'm not that much of an extrovert. And then I did the test, and all of my friends were like borderline or introverts. And I'm like, I've got enough extrovert for everyone. So the personality tests are very interesting, and they must be easier to kind of assist with processing some of these elements and things. I want to ask, so with knowledge, for example, I read that some of the things, like motor skills and stuff, you don't have to overtly teach another alter, because the body itself does remember certain things, and the mind is still the same. It's the boundaries are put into place by the system in the alters itself, and so depending on the system can depend on what information, because I remember you saying earlier about the types of amnesia as to what alters can and can't remember that other alters have done and things like that. When it comes to knowledge, do you alters in this system, you choose to share certain knowledge? I seem to understand. So with that in mind, when you, for example, when you were writing the essay for the Moon Knight Waxing and Waning collection, when you were doing that, obviously you were the one with the passion for Moon Knight, so you would want to do that. But did any of the other alters have an interest in Moon Knight, or learn things from when you were doing the essay? Like the almost cross-pollination in my mind of knowledge. How does that work, as far as at least you understand it within your own system?
Well, like I said before, our system is a little bit unusual in the fact that we have a lot more continuity of external world memories. And so because of that, we also have a lot more continuity as far as knowledge that we've learned, because, most of our knowledge that we learn in the external world. And so, so we have a lot more continuity as far as knowledge than a lot of other DID systems that have a lot more external world amnesia. Mm-hmm. But having said that, we also still have different skill sets as far as, some alters are better than others at writing or drawing or whatever.
Well, I want to link that with about religious beliefs, because I note that you said, you spoke with someone at I think a Bible group about DID, and that kind of started you off on a much better journey for yourselves. Do all of you alters believe? Do you all identify as Christian? Are there some that do not? And if you don't mind me asking, how has your faith been affected by the knowledge of your system? If you see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, first of all of us do identify as Christian. And I think the reason for that is also goes back to the fact that we have a lot more continuity of external world memory, because Doug basically became a Christian and dedicated his life to Christ before he found out about his DID. And so by the time we found out about all the other alters, we all were able to share that memory of Doug's, of that conversion. And so I think that's part of the reason why none of us really had any desire to not be Christian after that, you know. But our faith has been a tremendous help to us, actually, in dealing with our DID. In fact, we are very grateful to God that we came to our faith before we found out about our DID, because even with that, we had some suicidal thoughts, and I actually was cutting myself for a little while, but not suicidal cuts, but basically like very small cuts and self-injury, and our faith is the only thing that helped us be able to get through that and survive through those difficult times. And if it wasn't for our faith, I think we probably would have actually did our own life. And so I think our faith is the only reason why we're still here today, actually. And I think for a lot of people, it's tempting to say, you know, how can you believe in God when he allowed all these horrible things to happen to you in your childhood and you know, all this stuff? For me, we look at it as not that how could God have allowed us to these bad things to happen, but God helped us through all these bad things that happened to us. And without God, we wouldn't have made it through all these bad things. And so our therapist who diagnosed us with DID, he's a Christian also, and he actually told us, one of the first things he told us about DID is that he believes that it's a gift from God, because he said God is the one who created our brains to be able to have this coping mechanism, to be able to diverge different cultures, to be able to survive the trauma that we went through. And so we should actually be grateful to God that we have DID, because otherwise we might not have survived that trauma.
Yeah, it's a very it's a very nice way of looking at things. I appreciate the honesty there with the suicidal thoughts and the self-harming and things. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been not only to go through said events to have caused the trauma for the DID, but then also dealing with processing the trauma of the events while also navigating a system that you weren't aware of for quite a while. It must be just very mentally taxing. And so I hugely appreciate the honesty and openness there. And it's an interesting thing with religion, because I don't believe that there is a God. I'm more of a, I don't know how to say spiritual, but I think you may have listened to one of the podcasts, because you listen to lots of podcasts that I've done. But when I've, you know, my own religious beliefs and things is more just we're all kind of made out of energy and all that sort of stuff. And for me, there isn't an explicit deity. Not to say I think anyone's wrong for believing there is. That's completely down to one's own preference. But I can see that it helps change perspective, I think, religion in a lot of ways. And a lot of people, religion is a comfort blanket to a lot of people in a really positive way, not to demean religion or say that comfort blanket is wrong in any way. But it's that thing where there's hope, I think, is a lot of where faith comes from. And there's a comfort there. And I'm glad that your faith could really help you through those things. And it is interesting, because I think that if I did believe in a deity, I would probably subscribe more so to the idea that God creates people and individuals, but can't actually control everything that happens. You know, if you had 10 children and you put them all in a room together, you can't control everything they all do. You can try and put things in the way, you know, don't put sharp objects in there, but it's like you can only do a certain amount. And while you're focusing on some of them, then the other ones might be doing stuff, and you can try and teach them the best you can. I mean, this is not the same thing, and I'm not trying to compare this to people's children, but myself and my fiance, we've got a dog. We got her from a puppy, so all her bad habits are down to us. But all the training and things, that's from us, and we've trained her as best we can. But she has free will, and she's a dog. So, you know, we can try as we best we can to stop her doing certain things, but we can't overtly force her. And I think for me with my idea of a deity is that they've created things and they can guide to a degree, but they can't overtly control situations. Hence, why in the Bible mentions about God giving humans free will and things. So I think that for me, that's how I can rationalize the idea that how did God let these horrible things happen? And more so in kind of the perspective that you've come from, which is God maybe can't control the bad things that can happen, but God can guide an individual through certain trials and tribulations, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I think basically what we've been taught for years of church and everything is basically similar to what you're saying. It's basically there's God's perfect will and God's permissive will is what we've been taught. God's perfect will is what God would want for all of us to have perfectly happy lives and everything go smoothly. But because of the fact that God allowed us to have free will and that brought sin into the world, and that sort of caused a lot of chaos, and the chaos comes from the sin in the world, not from God. And God allows it to happen because God wants us to have free will, and God wants us to choose to have a relationship with Him and to choose to want to follow Him. He doesn't want us to force us to follow Him, and so that we're just like robots, forcing puppets. God wants us to choose Him and choose to have a relationship and follow Him. Basically how my understanding of it is.
Yeah, and it's down to interpretation. It's one of the things, because I myself am very interested by religion in a whole, the various Abrahamic religions and some of the more, the wider religions as well. I think they all have a degree of value and interest to them. But we're over the hour mark, thereabouts. So I thought I'd ask, I definitely want to have you on again, because this has kind of served as quite a nice introductory thing to the audience and to shine a bit more of a light on DID. But is any other sort of topics regarding this that I have not asked about that you want to speak about in this conversation? As I said, we'll have more in the future about DID and about some of the other things. I said, I think off air, that I want to read the Jed McKay Moon Knight run, and then I want to talk about that with you because Moon Knight's great and I really want to talk about it more. And obviously you were the consultant on two of the issues as well. So kind of those elements, and I'm sure we'll talk about the linear run as well. But are there any things in this conversation that you would like to raise or bring up that I haven't already touched upon?
Well, one of the things I want to talk about a little bit is I wanted to give my opinion on some of the best and some of the worst depictions of DID that I've seen in media. Because one thing that I found is that, in my desire to be a DID advocate and teach people about DID, not only want to call out the bad depictions, but I also want to call out when I see good depictions of DID. And actually, there have been several times that I've actually sought out the creators of the good depictions of DID that I've seen and actually given them compliments directly. And usually they've been responsive and saying thank you, and we really appreciate you telling us that. And it means a lot coming from someone who actually is DID system themselves, But basically, I would say probably one of the worst movies that I've seen is a movie called Identity, which this was back when we used to watch horror movies, which we don't anymore. But we saw the trailer for this movie, and the trailer didn't say anything about DID at all. And it was purposely not telling that part of it because it wanted to be a twist. And then you get in the movie, I got in the theater and we were watching the movie, and there was this killer that was going around killing people, and then about midway through the movie, you find out that the killer is actually an alter, and all the other people that he's killed have been alters within the same system, and it's an alter murdering other alters within the same system, which is something that's not even possible, because it's not actually possible for an alter to die internally in the system unless the physical body dies. It's kind of the opposite of the Matrix, where you die in the Matrix, you die in real life. Well, with the DID system, you can't die in the internal world unless you die in real life. So that kind of made us angry when we found that out after we had already paid money to see it in the theater. It wasn't just because of that, but it was because of also we found out that there were some of our authors that were very triggered by horror movies in general. That's why we stopped watching horror movies. But basically, any horror movie that has about DID is basically we count as among the worst depictions because they're very stigmatizing, and they perpetuate the myth that we're all, extremely violent, which we're not, most of us. One of the worst depictions go along with that I've seen in comic books is Typhoid Mary, that character. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's basically the combination of the three worst stigmas about people with DID. Because there's basically three alters in her system, and one alter is extremely violent and murderous, and that's the one called Bloody Mary. And then there's the one called Typhoid Mary, which is very sexually manipulative, and she tries to manipulate men through sex. That's another horrible stigma that people have about people with DID, which there can be, alters that are more focused on sex, but it's usually because of the fact that the system has been sexually traumatized when they were younger, is usually why that sort of an alter comes about. It's not because they just want to control other people through sex, It's because they themselves have been traumatized. And then the third alter called, it's just called Mary. She personifies the stigma of being a perpetually weak, perpetual victim, that never able to stick up for herself, and never, always extremely weak and extremely shy and vulnerable. And again, it is possible for DID alters or systems to be like that. It's because of the fact that they've been traumatized, and when they get the proper treatment and proper therapy, it can be possible to grow beyond that and be able to function better in society and everything. So yeah, Typhoid Mary is basically a combination of the three worst stigmas. So, so she's basically the worst depiction of DID in comics, I think. But actually, the depiction of that character in the Iron Fist Netflix series was actually a lot more positive. Actually, it was a lot more realistic as far as fiction.
I thought I recognized.
It was her name was Mary Walker in that series, and in that series there was two alters that were called Mary and Walker. And the Walker part was definitely more violent, but it was because she was like a hired mercenary, and she wasn't and she was ex-military. She had been in the military, and so it wasn't as cut and dried as, this one's good and that one's evil. It was there was a lot more shades of gray to it, and made it a lot more realistic that way. Anyway, then as far as movies, as far as the best depiction that I've seen in movies is probably this movie called What If It Works? It's a romantic comedy, actually, it's about a man that has OCD falling in love with a woman that has DID. And I've heard from people that have OCD that it's not a very good representation of the man as far as OCD representation, but excellent representation of DID as far as the woman. Mm-hmm. And for one thing, it portrays the switches as a lot more subtle and not as easy to notice as the other media, and portrays the different alters as being very human and very real and fleshed out and not so stereotypical as they are in a lot of fictions. I actually sought out the director of that movie and complimented her on what a good job she did. And I've seen interviews where she actually said that her brother actually has OCD, which is kind of surprising that she did so much worse with the representation of OCD. But my theory on that, which I'm not trying to say this is a fact or anything, this is just my own theory of why that might be, is maybe she felt more of a need to research the DID before making this movie because she didn't know as much about it, and she thought she knew enough about OCD because of her brother having it that she didn't feel a need to research that as much. That's just my theory. I don't know if it's the truth or not. But then as far as comic books, my absolute favorite depiction of DID is a series called Elves, spelled ELLE and then parentheses S. It's a series that it was actually made in France originally by a publishing company called Europe Comics, and then it was reprinted here in the United States by a publishing company called Ablaze. About a teenage girl in high school that has DID, although the second volume of the series it kind of explains it away as far as they give some. I don't want to give too much away as far as spoilers, but give some really weird explanation that it's not actually DID, but basically it is very realistic depiction of what DID is like, as far as what it's like to live with DID, especially just the fact that we actually personally know what it's like to be a high school student with DID, because we lived through that, and it was in a way, it was difficult for us to read because of that, because it very much hit home and reminded us of how difficult that was. But also, it was very realistic portrayal, and it was very heartwarming portrayal because it showed her friends. She had a group of friends who were very supportive of her and helped her to get through this difficult time of trying to figure out what was going on with her cultures and everything. And it also showed a lot of the internal world, which is something that a lot of portrayals of DID don't do very much of. A lot of times, if they do show the internal world at all, it's like one room with a table that they're all meeting around and talking. But this showed like each alter had their own entire universe within their mind, and they could were eventually able to travel between the universes, and it was very interesting how they portrayed it, and it was very true to the experiences I've had with working with different systems. That a lot of times, systems can have entire worlds within their mind and very creative worlds, and very doesn't have to necessarily follow the laws of physics in the external world. It can be anything that we imagine. So really appreciated the portrayal of that also. And so it's one thing that I mentioned to you that I wanted to connect with your friend Tony Farina, who has that the comic spotlight, because I would love to be able to talk more in depth about this series with him, on that podcast, because I think the series definitely deserves more attention.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure. I mean, Tony is a massive follower of this podcast. I think he may be the only person who's listened to every single episode, and he listens to them basically as soon as they come out. And I don't try and get anyone to listen to every single episode. I've been doing this for nearly 7 years, and some of the earlier episodes are mainly it's my fault. Is my intros are far too long. There's a couple of my intros are like 6 to 8 minutes long on like an hour long podcast, and I'm like, the intro does not need to be explaining what's inside the episode for 10 minutes when the episode's only an hour. So there's a few of them I'm like, yeah, maybe don't listen to all of them, but he's gone through and listened to everything. So him hearing you make that request, I'm sure he will contact me very soon. Well, once I release the episode, which will be a few weeks' time. I'm sure he'll make contact and want to do that and things. And I want to say as well with the DID stuff as well too. I'll put links in the description. I'll put resources and things, but just to hammer home one of the issues with the portrayal in the media is that the percentage of individuals with DID who, and you said this sort of at the start, but I want to reiterate this, the percentage of individuals with DID that commit violent crimes is not a higher percentage than individuals who have suffered trauma in their life. It's like, if you've suffered trauma in your life, there's a small percentage if you have experienced severe trauma, then if you haven't experienced severe trauma, there's a slight percentage increase on proportions of criminal activity, but DID is no higher than anyone else who's experienced severe trauma, which can come out in other mental illnesses and conditions and even PTSD. And I think that the films are making the stigma around DID worse, because if you said, if you said to someone like they've come from an abusive household, your first reaction isn't going to be, I feel unsafe. It's, oh, they've gone through something horrendously traumatic. That's unpleasant for them. They may have some triggers and things like that, but I want to try and help them where I can, where it's appropriate. And I think people really need to view DID as someone who's gone through some severe trauma and is dealing with that every day, as opposed to viewing it from the lens of something like Split, which is, I don't know what these other alters are thinking, because, at the end of the day, you don't actually know what anyone else is thinking ever. I'm getting married this year, and the person I'm getting married to I love. I don't know what she's thinking. I can assume, and I can ask her, and she can tell me. I don't actually ever know. She could be planning to kill me. I don't know. That doesn't. It's one of those things. I'm being a little bit glib about it, but it is one of those things where people, I think, they want to almost project. It's a lot of it is someone has trust issues on themselves, and they'll project it onto places and people who are being undeservedly misaligned from it. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to speak with you, is to try and help with clearing up some of that stigma and to really hit home that it's not dangerous. People with DID are not dangerous, or are not necessarily any more dangerous than people who've been through trauma. And there are plenty of people who've been through no trauma who are far more dangerous than anyone else. So I want to really hit home on that, getting rid of the stigma where we can. And if people look up the actual statistics and the studies that people have done, and again, there'll be resources in the description and the show notes, the information and the fact supports this. It shows that what's shown in the media is just completely wrong and really quite damaging in a lot of ways.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to correct you a little bit, because actually what that study said was that people with DID are not significantly higher percentage of rate of being perpetrators of violent crime than anyone else in the general public. It's not just anyone else that has trauma, it's just anyone else, period.
Okay, my apologies.
And that also goes, I think that there's been more generalized studies with other mental illnesses also, like schizophrenia and PTSD and stuff like that, that they're not really significantly higher than general, like as far as rates of perpetrating violent crime. But there is a higher percentage among people that have been traumatized, and especially people with DID, of being victims of violent crime. The reason for that is because a lot of people that are perpetrators of violent crime look for people that are vulnerable and they see as weak. And a lot of them get very good at recognizing people that have been traumatized already, are more vulnerable and weak, or they see as weak because of that. So fortunately, that means that we actually have a higher rate of being victims of violent crime as opposed to being perpetrators of violent crime. So it's basically the opposite of what people think it is. People think that we're dangerous, but actually we're more vulnerable to being in danger, actually.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a lot of the case with a lot of the stigma surrounding a lot of the mental illnesses. Ones that are more well-known than DID still suffer from certain other stigmas. But thank you for correcting me. That's what this podcast is about. It's about learning, and it's about, really acknowledging when one has their own biases or when they are incorrect in certain things. And I really appreciate you explaining all those sort of things. And again, links in the description, friends. So please make sure you double check the things, and they will have been sent from Leyna as well. So it's not me doing my own research. It will be things that Leyna has sent to myself that I'm passing on to yourselves. So there won't be anyone misremembering information like I just did, or anything along those lines. I did want to ask actually, Leyna, I know I said we wrap up, but just quick. I say quick. It may not be a quick answer, but with the internal world within where the majority of the alters lie within the system, like being in the internal world where things can is it being in like a dream state? Can you physically control things? Can you just be like, I want there to be a slide here, and then there's a slide? Like, is it that? I assume it's not that simple, because even daydreaming isn't that simple, but I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit more about the internal world when one of the alters is not experiencing co-consciousness and is not, or controlling the body itself.
Well, basically, I've heard a lot of DID systems make this comparison, but in this way, the internal world actually is a lot like the Matrix, where as far as before we are consciously aware of the fact that we have DID, when the alters are in the internal world, a lot of times they're not aware of the fact that there is a separate world on the outside. They think that this is the only real world they know, actually. So that sort of a situation, then usually there's not a lot of manipulation that's able to go on as far as like creating things out of thin air and that kind of thing. But then once we become aware of our situation, aware of our DID, aware of the differences between the internal world and the external world, internal world is still very real, but we're able to influence it more and be able to create things and be able to manipulate things a lot more. And the laws of physics only apply as far as we want them to apply, basically. So it's kind of like learning about our DID and learning about how things work is basically like taking the pill, to find out about the reality of what the matrix is,
It's a very good way of conveying it. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm sure I could delve more into that. I'm sure I could almost do a whole podcast on kind of the different inner workings of the of the system. But, we've spoken a lot. There's been a lot of really interesting things that you have, explained to us and elaborated to us and helped us try and clear up some of the stigma. And you've been very, very open and honest with your experience. And I really appreciate you reaching out and wanting to speak about these things. Is there anything else to touch upon in this conversation? And then you'll have time to do any plugs that you want to do.
There's just one more thing I wanted to touch upon about the stigma as far as why I do what I do. Basically, I heard other systems say online that they wish that people would just stop writing fictional media about people with DID. And I understand that sentiment because, there have been so many horrible, horrible portrayals of us in the fictional media. But I feel like because of the fact that a lot of people, the only thing they know about DID is from whatever media they've seen, as far as whether it's movies or comic books or whatever. A lot of people don't have the desire to dig deeper into it and read research papers about DID and that kind of thing. And so a lot of people, that's the only thing they're going to know, and that's the only way they're going to know about it. And so I think me personally and us personally as a system, we feel a responsibility to try to get our own experiences more known out there so that hopefully we can influence the creators of these media to make better portrayals of us through a better understanding of what the idea is actually like as opposed to what historically has been portrayed as. And I was so excited to be able to actually do that directly when I got the opportunity to work with Jed MacKay. That was like a dream come true for me because I never actually thought I would be able to actually work directly with a writer of Marvel Comics. I can actually say that I influenced the portrayal of Moon Knight in comics for the better directly, and that is just so amazing to me. I'm still pinching myself, I'm still, it's almost like I'm tempted to think it's a dream, but yeah, I was very excited to be able to do that, and that's why I do what I do, because I want there to be more positive portrayals of people like me out there in the media. People that only know about us from fictional portrayals might start to get a better idea of what we're like. And I think there has been some progress in that in recent years, but there needs to be a lot more progress, I think.
Well, I agree. I mean, even in this conversation, it's I've even done research and looked into things, and it's another podcast you've done, and I still got information wrong. So it's really just, if it can be more widespread without people, it's kind of that secondhand learning is, the kind of things. And unfortunately, it makes people learn the wrong things sometimes. Secondhand learning of just kind of, a lot of time people growing up in certain households or certain ideologies, it can happen. But like with this, more people talking about DID and more people getting rid of those stigmas and talking about it, it's going to help everyone who is afflicted with DID, but also it's going to help everyone else as well, because anything that helps a group of people, especially a group of people who have gone through such trauma to get to the point where they have DID, to help them is to help everyone else. It's just one of those things. So I think that the fact that you have been putting yourself out there and the fact that you've been taking this upon yourself to help spread information about DID is so incredibly important. And also it's amazing for you because it's really making yourself very vulnerable, especially where it's so misunderstood. And to even talk about DID, obviously, even if it's not directly spoken about, the trauma that you've experienced is undoubtedly going to play a part in your mind while discussing these kind of things. So I just want to thank you for being someone to put yourself out there and to not only come on the show, but also, go on the Into the Night Moon Knight podcast and the Hulk one, and then also, speaking with Jed MacKay, because also you were on the podcast with the Moon Knight podcast with Jed MacKay as well. So it's like it's so amazing that you've been able to have an impact that you've had so far. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to have even more of an impact as things go forward. But I did just want to thank you for putting yourself in that position, because it can't be something easy to do for anyone really, especially someone with DID, considering how much misinformation there is about it.
Yeah, and I want to thank you too for allowing me to be on your show, and definitely look forward to getting the opportunity to hopefully come on again and hopefully maybe be on some of the other shows that are affiliated with the Comics in Motion Network, maybe.
I'm sure we can figure that out. I'll definitely put in a good word with you for Tony. And Tony is such a delightful human being as well. I'm sure he would love to have you. But yeah, you're welcome to come on Genuine Chit-Chat again, and we can talk more about DID, but also at minimum, we will talk about the Jed McKay run. I'll get on to reading that. And then I'll have you on the show. We'll talk via email and stuff like that. But yeah, the door is always open. So is there anywhere, I know that there's the Douglas Vincent I keep about to say Twitter X account. Is that the main place that people would be able to keep up to date with what you're doing, or is there anywhere else where people can find you? The floor is yours.
Yeah, we're on X. Well, you can X us on X because like Elon Musk thinks he's Charles Xavier or something. So, you can X us on X at Doug Vincent 1138, and then we're also on Facebook. With Jonathan Vincent on Facebook, and we're also in the Facebook groups and Discords for both the Into the Night podcast and the Gamma Charge podcast, and so you can find us there. And we're not on Instagram yet, but we're kind of debating on whether or not we want to get into that. I don't know. But, yeah, I think that's about it for now.
And if they want to check out your work as well, I've said it a few times in the pod, and I'll mention it again. Waxing and Waning. It is essays on Moon Knight, edited by Scott Weatherly, released by Sequart, and it is the We Are Moon Knight essay, which yourself wrote, and that writing that has been the catalyst for not only me learning about DID, but also this exact conversation and the future conversations to come. So just again, thank you so much for your time on this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, my friends, make sure you check out the numerous resources in the description so you can check out more about Dissociative Identity Disorder, and make sure you pick up the Moon Knight essay book, Waxing and Waning, which Leyna contributed to, and it was also put together by friend of the show, Scott Weatherly of the 20th Century Geek podcast. In addition to that, make sure you check out episode 224 of Genuine Chit-Chat. It was released in February 2024, where myself and Scott talk about the Waxing and Waning Moon Knight essay book in detail, as well as talking about like a big retrospective of Moon Knight, all of his comics from like the late 70s, early 80s, all the way up to modern day. And that conversation is actually the reason that Leyna got into contact with me. So really, really great conversation there, especially if you enjoyed this one and if you're a fan of Moon Knight. As I mentioned in the intro, Leyna and I have been discussing more topics of conversation for Genuine Chit-Chat with her and many of our other alters. We've already got stuff in the pipeline, so I'm very excited for that, but I'll mention those when I get recorded. Leyna will be coming on the show more to talk about Moon Knight in the future and things, but some of our other alters have got other areas of interest, so we'll get to those when I've got those recorded. And what else is going on? Well, if you haven't already, make sure you check out mine and Megan's appearance on the Back to the Filmography podcast. We did The Meg, and I think that was released sort of a month or two ago now, as of recording this. But all of the guest spots I have done recently are noted in the description wherever you are listening to this podcast. Just scroll down, read there, and you will find the information you need. Last week's episode of Genuine Chit-Chat was the second release of mine and Megan's new show, Monthly M&M, where we talk about pantomimes in detail. Apologies if I sound a bit weird, my hay fever's playing up and has blocked my nose up loads, yay. So we've got that done. If you're a patron supporter, then you already have access to episode 3, which is very, very exciting. So you get one episode 1 month earlier than anyone else, and you also get every single week an episode of Afterthoughts where myself and Megan review TV shows, movies, things like that. The episodes are normally between sort of 10 and 20 minutes long, but you get one of those every single week. And there are a few afterthoughts where I do it solo or I do it with my friend Alex. So really great content coming out of Patreon as well as on this very feed. Please also make sure you check out the next edition of Disney Discussions. That is on the feed of Spider-Dan and the Secret Boars. I'll include a link in the description to that. So it's just continuing the collaboration that myself, Spider-Dan, Ria of the Femme-On Collective, and my amazing fiancée Megan. We've all been collaborating with Disney Discussions for I think about 2 years now. We do it every couple of months and we choose a different theme and things like that. And Dan's theme was very much on brand for him. So it's a really fun conversation that we all had a great time doing. So please make sure you check out Disney Discussions. I think that's number 12 on Spider-Man's podcast, but I'll make sure I include it in the YouTube playlist Disney Discussions so you can check it out every single episode right there, or just type in Disney Discussions into any podcast catcher. Now, what have we got coming up in the future? Well, next week I think is going to be the next installment of Clone Wars Conversations, so that's going to be a lot of fun. I've been recording those like once every few weeks or so myself, Matt and Dave are getting quite ahead with those, which is quite nice. Then the week after that will probably be my conversation with Tony Farina. But I'll talk more about that once that conversation is recorded, and then from there, obviously, there's going to be more monthly M&M, and there's a few other bits and pieces I've got in the pipeline as well. So a lot of cool stuff going on. As well as my normal podcast output, which is Genuine Chit-Chat episodes weekly, and also Patreon Afterthoughts episodes weekly, I'm also going to be doing a new weekly show for the next 7 weeks, which is the weekly Star Wars discussion show on the show Acolyte. So whenever these live action Star Wars shows come out, I usually do weekly discussion shows. I have a different guest or a couple of guests on each week to talk about that episode in question and their thoughts about it. Some of the people I have on the show have their own podcasts, and some of them are like massive Star Wars fans like me, and other ones are lesser Star Wars fans, so we get a nice wide berth of people coming on the show to talk about these things. I've done it for Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, Kenobi, Andor, pretty much all of them I've done for, and I'm very, very excited for Acolyte. So that'll be airing on the podcast feed of Comics in Motion, whereas if you're listening on YouTube right now, it will be released the full video version on youtube.com/genuinechitchat, and also it'll be on the feed of Star Wars Comics in Canon. I don't know if we're going to release any of the episodes on Genuine Chit-Chat or not. I might release the first one as a little promo thing, but we shall see. The main place you can find it is subscribing to youtube.com/genuinechitchat. That's where every single episode of my Star Wars stuff, my Genuine Chit-Chat stuff, a few other bonus things I do, all are on there, and they're all in playlists, so it's a great way to delve deeper into the back catalogue if you're a newer listener. So aside from that, my friends, obviously support me on Patreon if you can. It's only £1 a month. You get instant access to all 240 odd episodes of Afterthought, and you can listen to that on any podcast app you like, including Spotify or anywhere that you so desire. So please consider supporting the show in that way. If you can't support the show financially for any reason, that's perfectly okay. You can support me in a wide variety of other ways. If you're on YouTube, you could like and subscribe and leave comments and things. If you have social media at all, you can share with your friends. If you don't have social media, but you still want to share it, you can tell people you know about the podcast. But also a really, really great, quick and easy way to support the show, aside from subscribing, which I really would like everyone to do if you could, is leaving reviews and ratings. On Spotify, it takes like 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review. On Apple Podcasts and Audible and places like that, you can leave written reviews, which I hugely appreciate, but again, they don't take too long, especially the amount of content I'm giving you for free. So please consider doing that if you could, and if you can, you get an extra gift from me, which is a portion of my undying love and appreciation. So please leave reviews, please share, and if you could, please support on Patreon. But friends, that's going to be enough from me at the moment. So make sure you follow me on social media at Genuine Chit-Chat on Instagram, X, Facebook, Threads, TikTok, YouTube, all kinds of different places. I don't know if YouTube is technically social media, but I don't know. But please follow me on those places, share, review, all that usual stuff. I appreciate you all, and I'll be talking to you next week.
You have just experienced host, creator, everything elser of Genuine Chit-Chat, and also the host and creator of Star Wars Comics in Canon, found on the Comics in Motion podcast, Mike Burton.